Unit 5 is on land and water use. In the first half of the unit, we're going to look at how we use that land to produce the food that we need and some of the impacts that agriculture has on land. So we're going to start with something called the Green Revolution, which sounds like an environmental movement, but actually it isn't, and a little bit about GMOs. So Green Revolution was really when we switched to industrial agriculture. Our goal was to increase our yields of crops per unit of land or cropland. So this is back in the late 60s, early 70s when we really started shifting to mechanizing our farms, using fertilizers, irrigation, using pesticides, and even improving our crop varieties that we'd been using for agriculture over the last 100 years. So when we say green, we mean produce more food and more crops. All right, so starting with mechanization, the big thing is that it automatically uses more fossil fuels. But what we see happen over time is something called economies of scale. As our output increases, the average cost of production falls. So when we have these huge industrial monoculture farms, we're able to ultimately lower food prices. So there is large upfront costs, but in the end, it's justified by the amount of profits from the increased production. The problem is that some of our small farms cannot expend the upfront cost, and so we lose a lot of small farms to these larger industrial farms. And again, the more machinery we're using, the more our reliance on fossil fuels. All right, looking at fertilizers, we have two types of fertilizers. There is organic and synthetic. So with the Green Revolution, we really started seeing a greater use of synthetic fertilizers. Both synthetic and organic, what they do is replace the nutrients that have been depleted by these huge monoculture industrial farms. So organic fertilizer is either crop waste, which we call green manure, or animal manure, and it actually is better for the soil than synthetic fertilizers because it adds the nutrients and that organic matter to replenish the soil. With synthetic, or we call them inorganic fertilizer, we are able to target the specific needs of the soil. So depending on what crop we're growing, we can have specific amounts of nitrates, phosphates, and potassium. They're also easily absorbed because we're putting the correct amounts in the soil. But again, these synthetic fertilizers do not add that organic material to the soil, and they can cause the soil to become compacted over time. Benefits of fertilizers, both synthetic and organic, is that they're easily applied and absorbed. With the synthetic, we can adjust to target for specific crops or how to improve specific soils. Without these synthetic fertilizers, there was no possible way we could produce the amount of food we need to feed the world. There are drawbacks to using these synthetic fertilizers. It takes fossil fuels to process them, to make them, to transport them to stores, to transport them to farms, and of course for the farmers to put these on their crops. A big problem that we experience is runoff of these fertilizers. When these fertilizers get into groundwater and waterways, they also act to fertilize the water, which can cause algae blooms. And again, when you're not adding organic matter to the soil, then over time, it actually decreases the quality and fertility of your soil. All right, so pesticides, we also saw an increase of the use of these during the Green Revolution. And these are things that we spray on our fields to control pests. We also started using more irrigation. Irrigation is simply adding water so that we can grow crops in areas that otherwise wouldn't have enough. So what it does is it increases our crop growth rates. So if we look at how farms have changed in size and how different areas compare, if you look at the U.S., our average farm size is much larger than any other area in the world. And also in that far column to the right, you can see we have the fewest small farms as well. with industrial agriculture, we have monocropping. You've heard me say that term. Mono means one. So this is where we grow one crop on a large area of land. So it's very efficient and productive, and it makes sense from an economical standpoint. The problems are that it greatly decreases the biodiversity because you have one crop. So it's going to be more vulnerable to pests, especially if you're using GMO seeds and your crop is all genetically identical. When we spray pesticides, not only do we get rid of the pests, but also we get rid of the predators of those pests, which means that we end up using more chemicals in the long run. Okay, my screen is freezing, so bear with me just a minute. There we go. All right, so GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are, when we use those on the farms, we are copying genes from a species that has a desirable trait and inserting those genes into another species. So probably the biggest example is the BT corn and BT cotton. There exists a bacteria in the soil that naturally produces an insecticide that keeps it from being eaten by insects. So what we've done is we've taken that gene that's responsible for producing that insecticide, and we have copied it into the genome of these crop plants. So now they naturally produce that insecticide. This particular insecticide is not harmful to humans. So we no longer have to spray the chemical pesticides on these crops that we did in the past because they're now producing their own toxin. Now, we've been using artificial selection for years. If you look at the diagram on the bottom left, the teosinte was a grain, and that's what, over time, we have crossbred to become our modern corn. You can see in the picture on the right all of the crops that have emerged from crossbreeding with the wild mustard plant. So broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, all of those came from the same plant. And that's just pollinating these crops. Now, today, we can actually speed up that process by removing, after we isolate a specific gene, like the example shown here is that BT corn again, that has the gene that's toxic to certain pests. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about GMO crops. There's actually only about 10 or so that are approved by the USDA. But I would suggest that you pause it and read through some of the traits. One of my favorites is the apples that are genetically modified so they don't turn brown when you slice them. But some of the traits have to do with nutrients, some have to do with the actual growing of the crop in terms of drought tolerance or insect resistance. So take a minute and read through some of the traits that we have been able to change in these crops. All right, so now looking at some of the impact that these agricultural practices that we introduced through the Green Revolution have had. With monoculture, we tend to plow our fields and till up the soil at the end of the season. What this does, it turns the soil upside down, so the crop residue gets pushed down into the soil, it kills seeds and insects, and then you're ready to plant your seeds. The problems with plowing and tilling is that anytime you remove vegetation and there's no longer roots holding the soil in place, then now it's susceptible to the elements, wind and rain, and we can lose some of that topsoil to erosion. It also, when it stirs up and tills up the soil, it exposes organic matter to oxygen, so it breaks down and releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and ultimately can reduce the organic material in the soil. So this can lead to soil degradation over time. It also requires us to use more irrigation, which has its own set of problems that we'll talk about on another day, and also overproduction. Looking at another farming type and the impacts it has, and this is usually used in tropical areas, smaller farms, it's called slash and burn. So a small area of land is cleared, and then the trees and vegetation that are cut down are burned. What that does is it puts the ash and the nutrients in the soil, so it's almost like a natural fertilizer. So it allows smaller communities to survive in areas where land is unproductive. So this is usually in tropical areas. Tropical areas actually have nutrient-poor soil because the nutrients are recycled so quickly, and this happens a lot in our tropical rainforests. Now with slash and burn farming, when we burn the vegetation, that does release carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Again, when you remove vegetation, you're exposing that soil to erosion. And if used by larger communities, and this is what we're starting to see, is deforestation and habitat loss. Now, sometimes these forests, when the farms are no longer productive, they'll abandon them and the original vegetation can reestablish through secondary succession. But again, because there's not many nutrients in this soil, sometimes we get what is called desertification. If the land can't grow crops, it turns into a desert. All right, and that is it for today's notes.